Hello and welcome to the second annual Dean's Honor Symposium. The students presenting come from different areas of study and years in their academic careers. They have been working together since January to blend cross-disciplinary projects into a cohesive panel. There are panels at every hour in this room and Star Foundation Hall, which is just across the way, and an additional panel at 4 p.m. in room L104. Please check your program for panel locations. This presentation will end at 50 minutes after the hour to allow transition to the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Juan de Castro, and it is my pleasure to introduce our panel, Subversive Ontologies, Mapping Gender onto the Divine Body, which explores the intersection of gender, religion, and spirituality. The panel is composed of three brilliant young scholars: Hannah Rasmussen LaBonte, who is completing the self-designed major Gendered Ecologies, Ecologies of Gender; Josephine Cameron, who is a history major with special interest in religious iconography of the Victorian era; and Emily Rogal, who is a religious studies major. In particular, Hannah examines how the colonial gender binary still structures contemporary trans discourse and uses non-binary gender examples from around the globe to propose a new gender politics. Josephine analyzes the manner in which the doctrine of Helena Blavatsky, the co-founder of the Theosophical Society and one of the major spiritual leaders of the late 19th century, undermines binary gender frameworks. Finally, Emily explores the alternative uses for the mikveh, the ritual cleansing bath used in the Jewish tradition by women after menstruating. Before hearing from our wonderful panelists, I want to say a couple of words about the title. As we know, ontology comes from the Greek words ontos, being, and logia, study of. It is therefore an account of what exists. As should be clear, Hannah, Josephine, and Emily are rejecting patriarchal ontologies, instead proposing an account of what exists and an account of what we believe that incorporates gender issues in all of their complexity. I want to add that it's been a great pleasure working with Hannah, Josephine, and Emily. I actually feel I have been the student, learning much about topics I knew little about. So without any further ado, let's hear from Hannah.
Hi. Thanks everyone for coming. Can you hear me? I want to begin by acknowledging the unceded land we're on today, that of the indigenous Lenni Lenape, and my status as a guest on it. So my talk today seeks to move us beyond a contemporary feminism's notions of gender by breaking down its falsely progressive discourse on transness. I wish to formulate a new gender politic through a decolonial and non-Western gender lens. A disclaimer. I don't mean to create a binary between the West and East in my analysis. There are oppressive and oppressed forces everywhere, and rather I'm trying to complicate notions of what progressive feminism looks like, which have often been racially divided into the liberal New World, the West, and the backwards Old World, the East. And before beginning, I want to thank Geeti Das for her generous guidance and feedback. I'm really grateful for her encouragement. To begin, 1513. In his genocidal trespassing of modern-day Panama, Spanish colonizer Vasco Núñez de Balboa encountered indigenous two-spirits, those whom he observed having queer sexual relationships and perceived as cross-dressing, and he fed them to his massive dogs as food. This is the ultimate practice of the gender binary, denying its own social construction, by erasing from the face of the earth any evidence contrary to a natural gender binary. A brief definition. Gender binarism is the principle of two biologically exclusive and oppositional genders, male and female. The gender binary is so powerful that we must conform to it in order to be recognized as people, in order to become people. In my studies here, I've been really interested in tracing where this binary came from, and I've identified 3 paradigms that have either caused belief in the gender binary or been used to rationalize gendered violence. The first paradigm is the divine gender binary. As Josephine and Emily have so generously taught me, there's no one story of gender or creation in the Bible, and yet many Christian movements have extracted a gender binary from one biblical narrative. The classic God creates Adam and Eve from Adam's rib, and then Eve is the perpetrator of the fall. In this paradigm, God's divinity is the rationale for the irrefutability of the gender binary. This religious rhetoric was and is used to rationalize the demonization and genocide of racialized people when non-binary schemas of gender were observed. But as science, technology, and rationalism boomed in the 17th and 18th centuries, in Europe and the Americas, Cartesian dualism became the reigning schema for the gendered body. In the 1640s, French philosopher René Descartes articulated the philosophical theory that the mind and body are 2 distinct ontological entities, their relation being that the immaterial mind finds consciousness through the material body. And while each individual was acknowledged to have a mind and body, they were very gendered and organized in a hierarchy. Their relation, or being the mind, is characterized by intellect, clarity, and rational thought, similar to the archetypical God and Adam figures, masculine object. And then the body is portrayed as emotional, fallible, or reactive, a feminine object, much like Eve. This separation of mind and body is foundational to how we perceive the gendered body to work, and it's supported by the next paradigm, the biological sex binary. Biological sex dualism describes the ideology that humans come only in 2 sexes and thus only 2 genders are possible. The truth is, what we call biological sex is actually more varied, complex, and nuanced than a 2-sex model. Anne Fausta Sterling, professor of biology and gender studies at Brown, has done extensive studies on the myth of sex dimorphism and estimates that up to 2% of the population have biological makeups that are different from what is considered biologically regular male or female. I see all these paradigms as deeply anti-feminist. Eve is the damned and derivative helpmate, hierarchical body schemas that support gendered stereotypes, and an outdated scientific outlook on sex. And that's why it's disturbing and surprising to find their logics embedded with the mainstream discourse about transness. B. Binohan, trans Pinay, Pinay means Filipina, independent scholar who uses they, them pronouns, points out just how pervasive Cartesian dualism is in Western trans discourse. They write, "This sole identity is who you are, and you must work to overcome or transition away beyond this cage of flesh that oppresses you." So the Cartesian dualism of the mind and body, I think, is really clear in that quote. And before going on, cisgender definition refers to someone whose gender, quote unquote, matches the sex that they were assigned with at birth. And in contrast, I think as exemplified really well by this diagram, which I don't agree with, but I think shows how we still think about the body in terms of sex and gender, mind and body, I think shows that the transgender person is always expected to be moving towards a wholeness of body and mind, as exemplified by the ideal cisgendered person. I also have the word transnormativity up there, which exemplifies this sentiment. It's the expectation for a surgical, if not definite, external transition, and for a trans person to pass as a cisgendered person. I certainly don't say this to criticize anyone who wishes to do so, transition and pass, but emphasize it as an oppressive structure put upon trans identity to defend the gender binary, to render genders other than male and female invisible. So I've been speaking kind of abstractly for a while, and now I want to talk about the real-life impact of the gender binary. 2016 had the highest number of recorded trans murders. 27. And that number is much likely higher due to unreported cases or cases in which the victim was misgendered. Between 2010 and 2016, 72% of trans homicide victims were Black trans women and femmes. This is evidence not only of misogynoir, but cis-sexism. This violence is a continuation of the first contact colonial murder of non-binary indigenous peoples, a punishment for nonconformity to the white institution of gender. Transnormativity also undermines non-binary people's existence, pressuring them to conform to gender realities not their own, as mentioned earlier. These next slides are from a photo project by the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, that document the cisgendered expectations for non-binary and trans people. I'll just let you read them on your own. Okay, so now time for more encouraging information. In this next section, we'll explore non-binary gender outside of the West in order to dismantle the constructed naturalness of the gender binary, which I think a lot of us are really used to just by virtue of where we grew up and the people we grew up around. So I understand if it's unfamiliar, but I hope this is as exciting to you as it is to me in terms of different futures that we can imagine. So sacred non-binary gender. To counter the narrative created by some Christians of a divine gender binary, non-binary genders are actually integral parts of many spiritual cosmologies and ritual. I was excited to find this ancient Sumerian text because Sumer, like we learn in middle school, is like the first civilization or whatever. But there are actually 6 different types of people recorded in their creation story, among them the woman who cannot give birth and the one who has no male organ or female organ, and they receive special spiritual roles like priestesses and royal aides. This is a bit more of a detailed story. In an essay, Salish Wesley, pictured here, a shallow twin-spirited woman, indigenous to Turtle Island or North America. In an essay, she speaks about the tensions in her twin-spirited identity, her desire for a spiritual home amongst her kin and her peoples, many of whom have been made transphobic, so discriminatory against trans people by Catholic missionaries that settled in their area. And in her journey, Wesley asked her grandmother for a gender identity in her native language, and her grandmother gifts her this word here, which I can't pronounce. And Wesley translates it to two-spirited woman. And having an identity in her native language is part of Wesley's process of retrieving the traditional spiritual role of two spirits. And so apprenticing with her grandmother, Wesley embodies this retrieval process through weaving a traditional women's cedar shawl, which she's wearing there. And she wears it to an opening dance at a memorial for a nearby family's late two-spirited child. And in her essay, Wesley writes, "I needed to dance for more than just this memorial, for 500 years plus of two-spirited ancestors and their deleted identities." So these are the non-binary identities I came across in my research. There are obviously many, many more. And rather than do kind of like a survey approach, I wanted to go more in depth with a couple so I could kind of retain the integrity and make sure to get specific voices. Muxes are integral to Zapotec culture in Mexico, specifically in Oaxaca. And they're celebrated in a 4-day festival, the celebration of the bold seekers of danger, which is pictured on the right here. Alex, who identifies as Muxe in the center, the orange dress, her father says, "It was God who sent him, and why would I reject him? God sent him for both of us." And so while the Muxe are integral and celebrated in their culture, they also are victims of homophobia due to conservative Christian rhetoric that was imposed during colonization, especially in rural areas. Fa'afafines of Samoan culture are people assigned male at birth, but who are raised as or grow naturally into feminine sensibilities. There's a great spectrum of Fa'afafine identity. Phineas Hartson, up there on the left, identifies as Fa'afafine, but presents as male, and he doesn't see kind of any conflict between his femininity and masculinity. Leo Tenoy was the sixth born of 7 boys in his family, so his family raised him as a girl to help his mother, and that's kind of a traditional identity creation for the Fa'afafine, but it's kind of less practiced now. And then Yamanya on the bottom there has identified as female since she was born and supported by her family in her identity. Hina Le Moana Wangkalu, also known as Kumuhina, the adult here, is Mahu from Hawaii, and the founder of a public charter school that preserves Hawaiian cultural identity through education. And she describes Mahu identity as an embodiment of the feminine and masculine qualities inside of all of us. She says, before colonization, Mahu were valued and respected as caretakers, healers, and teachers of ancient traditions, and that despite 200 years of colonization and repression, we are still here. She has coined the terms kane wahine and wahine kane, boy girls and girl boys. So non-binary kids in her class, like Ho'onani Kamai, who's pictured here, have a place. But there's a PBS documentary on YouTube called A Place in the Middle, and it's really amazing and moving. So that's where this clip was from. And in the spirit of not romanticizing non-binary existence outside the West, I must emphasize that non-binary people still face stigma in their homelands, often leading to social disenfranchisement and poverty. And as celebrated as they are, as exemplified, they may be feared as well and isolated as a result, or still constrained by heterosexual expectations. And so while they may not live within the Western gender binary and all the oppression that leads to, they're still subject to oppressive dynamics within social orders that include them. So I wish to emphasize that as used to it as we are of just having 2 genders, that these non-binary genders and identities relationships are whole. They are not transgressions or deviances from a natural order. They are the interdependent and tangled both and reality of this world. As Majorie Ann Napewastwin Schutzer, a Lakota Blackfoot Winkte or Two-Spirit says, Winkte are not branded as threats to a rigid gender ideology, but rather we are considered an affirmation of humanity's original pre-gendered unity. We are representatives of a form of solidarity and wholeness which transcends the division of humans into men and women. So now for that new gendered politic we're talking about. The way I see it is that if feminism continues to rely on the gender binary to theorize bodies or liberation, it will never accomplish its goal to, in the words of bell hooks and sexism, sexist exploitation and oppression. For inherent in the gender binary, in its history and its schema, is sexist oppression. The practice of gender violence is a colonial and imperialistic legacy, and thus the responsibility of those living under its protection to ameliorate. Given that, how can Western, especially white feminists, be accountable? Individually, I believe it requires researching histories of buried genders and not transposing Western notions and language of gender onto other peoples. Further, using this history as a support system for young queer people, especially those of color, and for feminists with varied privilege to situate themselves within racialized gender histories of violence and survival. Sociopolitically, I see decolonizing feminism as requiring Western white feminists to work with indigenous peoples for land repatriation and against environmental racism. It requires divesting from women's rights and neoliberal inclusion politics and instead standing behind queer, trans people of color, and non-Western gender movements to end geospecific modes of exploitation and oppression. As Geethi Das and Oyewumi Oriranke have impressed to me, Western feminists cannot theorize gender oppression writ large from within a binaristic gender order when the gender binary is not universal. If gender looks different everywhere, as evidenced, so will oppression and so will liberation. As such, listening must become a central facet and principle for Western feminists, who so often speak first. And while there is much work to do in tackling injustice everywhere, the identities explored today offer us the evidence and therefore hope of a world beyond the binary. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Josephine. In this presentation, I will be discussing the proto-feminist roots of the Theosophical Society and the teachings of Helena Blavatsky in the context of 19th century Victorian America. I will argue that despite Blavatsky's avidly apolitical stance, she and other women who followed her doctrine did much to desegregate the political and spiritual realms. The literature surrounding the conflict between religion and science in the 19th century in America has distinct qualities which echo the language of philosopher and psychologist William James when, in 1897, he wrote that, "Now our science tells our faith that she is shameful, and our hopes that they are dupes. Our reverence for truth leads to conclusions that make all reverence a falsehood." Due to the inroads into Protestant Christianity made by the popularity of Darwinist theory, for example, the issue seemed plain. Science, and therefore truth, lay on one side, and faith on the other, not to be united again. During this so-called crisis of faith, there was a deep-seated desire for certainty, and the majority of those confronted with the principles of science in opposition to the pillars of their faith could no longer find unity in the world around them. The Americans drawn to Theosophy in the 19th century were of a culturally distinct and elite upbringing. This educated class was able to see the so-called crisis of faith then as an issue that was far more complicated than an unbreakable wall dividing faith from science. Instead, many viewed the conflict as an opportunity to ask questions and face challenges that would lead toward a higher form of knowledge. Women, in particular, were drawn toward new philosophies as they began to recognize their lack of power within the dominant mainline Protestant Christian church. In the mid-19th century, women comprised the numerical majority of participants in religion, and within the United States, and as Anne Browdy claims, have done so since Christianity became the dominant faith. Despite the fact that women had reason to regard religion as something within their control, it was dominated almost exclusively by men. Women filled the pews while men led them in prayer and in belief. As Mary Farrell Bednarowski writes, certain aspects of institutionalized religion, especially Christianity, have been responsible for excluding women from positions of leadership in American religion. These are the pervasive use of masculine language for the divine, which has tended to link the male with the numinous and exclude the female, the belief that the fall resulted in human depravity and serves to prove the moral weakness of women, and the assumption that woman's subordination to man was divinely ordained and revealed in Scripture, and that this subordination has implications for marriage and for woman's place. Within the mainstream religious tradition of the 19th century, gender roles were both created and reproduced, as women were simultaneously disenfranchised and relied upon for their presence and piety. While many women of this period perceived their association with devoutness and morality to be a source of power, others were growing increasingly unsettled by the subjugation to men within the mainstream religious order. As this agitation grew, a number of marginal female-led religious and spiritual groups cropped up, within which women were able to achieve leadership positions and equal status with men. The first meeting between Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, more frequently referred to as HPB or Madame Blavatsky, and Henry Steele Olcott, which took place in 1874, was a turning point in the history of alternative spiritualities in the West. In 1875, the two established the Theosophical Society in New York City, which you can see here, a drawing of the original, which was on 47th Street, if you ever want to visit, which was a hotbed for people interested in studying occult phenomenon, with an initial objective of bringing together people to study and elucidate issues present in occultism, the Kabbalah, and more. Its roots lay within the spiritual movement of the 19th century. In fact, the pair met at a farmstead in Vermont, where they had both gone to investigate occult phenomenon. But both HPB and Alcott fervently rejected much of what spiritualism stood for. While spiritualism was primarily concerned with communing with the dead through the use of mediums, many of whom were women, as you can see here, which is an illustration of a seance being held by a number of female mediums in 1851, the Society proposed a unique blend of Western science, spiritualism, and Eastern mysticism, and was organized as a non-proselytizing, non-sectarian entity. Its earliest primary goal was, as you can see here, although maybe you can't read it, was to form the nucleus of a universal brotherhood of humanity, without distinction of race, creed, caste, or color. From the beginning, it was clear that there was a distinct emphasis on equality within the society, and though it was founded by both HPB and Alcott, HPB served as its doctrinal leader. As Carla Rousseau writes, early Theosophy was among the prominent movements opposing the establishment in an era when many of the formerly unassailable pillars of certainty had lost their appeal. Those drawn to Theosophy were cultural elites who sought a place to shape their questions, develop answers, and feed their need for spiritual sustenance, which had been brought into question during the widespread crisis of faith. Blavatsky considered the Christian God to be, quote, a bundle of contradictions and a logical impossibility, the gigantic shadow of a man, and not man at his best either. A bit harsh. In the Key to Theosophy, an early version of which can be seen here, she wrote that we believe in a universal divine principle, the root of all, from which all proceeds, and within which all shall be absorbed at the end of the great cycle of being. As Joy Dickson explains in Sexology and the Occult, this highest deity was both sexless and formless. It was and is entirely unconditioned, neither father nor mother. As this absolute spirit manifested itself in the universe, it created itself as a series of oppositions, positive versus negative, spirit versus matter, masculinity versus femininity. This complex cosmic sexual order was at once symbolic and actual. According to Blavatsky, these events occurred, quote, on the plane of metaphysical abstraction, or rather the plane whereon that which we call a metaphysical abstraction is reality. You can tell how convoluted her writing was at times. But by Blavatsky's account, both humanity and the absolute had begun as asexual, and then androgynous or bisexual, only becoming sexed over time. I'll just go out. The original Adam, a spiritual androgyne, was created in the image of a double-sexed God, and the Christian idea of the fall, which one version of is pictured here, within HPB's conception, was reinterpreted as the fall into conscious life. The Genesis account of the separation of Eve and Adam provided an account of the downward spiral of humanity into both materiality and sexuality. As Dickson writes, in order for humanity to come to true self-consciousness, it was necessary that it descend from the spiritual into the physical and material world. Entangled in its garment of flesh, or its coat of skin, the spirit, itself sexless and unconditioned, was increasingly identified with its physical form. One of the most important goals of spiritual development, according to Blavatsky, was to realize and manifest something of the balanced bisexual unity of the absolute in one's earthly existence. The meaning of gender within Blavatsky's doctrine was complex, to be sure, but one of the most compelling components for her female followers was that it actively resisted the very pervasive Christian idea of a masculine deity, See, you can see the many, many images of God here. I'm sure you've seen many more. But the idea that man was the superior being of the universe was nowhere to be found in her work. A collection of HPB's writing collected by Annie Besant, who was a later leader of the Theosophical Society, sorry, have my hand on the keyboard, and published after her death, claimed that the fully evolved spiritual being would be a so-called divine hermaphrodite, entirely disconnected from sex. In this so-called spiritually regenerated man, a bond would form between the higher manas, or mental body, and the buddhi, the spiritual soul. Much like the esoteric conjunction of Hermes, the male principle, and Aphrodite, the female principle, pictured here in various forms, this combination was said to yield the divine hermaphrodite, or androgyne. Blavatsky's vision of evolutionary progress consisted of an eventual movement back to androgyny, an evaporation of the material, and ultimately union of the divine, all of which could be achieved through gender balance and the equal representation of both sexes in the earthly socio-political order. In other words, Blavatsky and Theosophists believed all human beings to incorporate both masculine and feminine elements that reach perfection and balance, hence the title of my piece. Additionally, in Blavatsky's view, the experience of living in a sexed body was a discipline for the soul, which was repeated through reincarnation, thus enabling men and women to understand their own gender identity outside of the most biologistic of Victorian formulations of separate spheres, which I'm sure you've all heard about, drawing on past life experiences as an explanation of their often unconventional sense of self. Within this doctrine, sex distinctions had no ultimate validity due to the belief that human beings had or would eventually experience a series of male and female rebirths over the course of their existence. Absolute maleness and femaleness then were possible only at the midpoint of the cycle of sex evolution, and as Naomi Lloyd writes, quote, between those points, humans were in the process of becoming male or female. They experienced disjunctions between physical sex and gender subjectivity. Those on the cusp of the changes, there's a little bit of this quote here. Those on the cusp of those changes balance both maleness and femaleness. In a number of ways, those who followed Blavatsky's doctrine influenced and reworked a number of claims regarding gender and sexuality, melding complications of the essentialist social constructionist binary into their spiritual credo, while citing a unique form of science as their evidence. Women, then, were able to use this conception of gender as a means to step beyond the confines of the women's sphere, and thus creating a homology between the individual body and the social political body. Spirituality and religion have often been written about, especially recently, as antiquated phenomenon which have no place in progressive politics or traditional life. However, Blavatsky's doctrine and countless writings fueled the idea within many of her followers that there was a distinct connection between the self and the physical and spiritual worlds. As such, women's rights became an issue for early Theosophists because disenfranchised womanhood came to stand metonymically for the disenfranchisement of spirituality in a secular, capitalist, materialist, and male-dominated culture. Early Theosophists, then, were among the first to agitate for women's suffrage because they saw it as a way to reclaim the public the public political realm as a sacred space. The spiritual commitments of these women, then, were precisely what led them into the fields of broader social reform in secular society. Although HPB wrote in the first issue of the Theosophist, their semi-annual journal, that the society was unconcerned about politics, she also wrote in favor of women's suffrage as early as 1880, which is very early for those of you not aware, claiming if man is endowed with stronger muscles, women's nerves surpass his in capacity for endurance. The biggest brain ever found, in weight and in size, is now proven to have belonged to a woman, but brain has nothing to do with the electoral question. To drop a ballot into the urn, no one is required to have invented powder or to be able to lift 500 kilograms. If so many women were found good enough to reign and govern nations, they surely must have been fit to vote. Law was ever unjust to a woman, and instead of protecting her, it seeks but to strengthen her chains. Here's a picture of Blavatsky pondering neurosexism. When asked if women in the Theosophical Society enjoyed equal rights with men, she answered that in the spiritual component of the spiritual component of the society and within the ranks of the adepts, sex had no bearing on one's standing. The important thing was, instead, the desire to serve others and the willingness to labor for one's goal. Much has been written about the Theosophical Society, especially in regard to its long history of female leadership and connection to various women's movements. The majority of this literature, however, has centered around the Society's activities in the early to mid-20th century, rather than the 19th century, under the leadership of Annie Besant, mentioned earlier, thus discrediting Blavatsky and the early female theosophists as spiritual and political actors. In order for us as contemporary feminist historians to have a better understanding of the role religion played in shaping the women's movement, it is important for us to reclaim the narratives of these understudied individuals who offered much to contemporary forms of feminine spirituality. Thank you all for coming.
Hi, everybody. My name is Emily Rogel. I'm a senior here, and my presentation is called Emerging from the Waters, Feminist Jewish Mikveh Practice and Ritual Innovation. So I want to begin with a quote from a book I read this semester by a Laguna Pueblo Native American woman named Leslie Marmon Silko. And the quote says, "What she said, the only cure I know is a good ceremony." I want to invite you during the course of my ritual, or of my presentation, to think of a ritual that is really important to you, because obviously it's really important to me. Ritual has always been a big part of my life. I'm from an interfaith family, and I've watched as people have prayed the rosary, built altars, lit Hanukkah candles, and have come to know that ritual does something to us. They validate us, they bring us closer to one another, to God, they have social and cosmic importance. Judaism, a tradition that I am both a part of and study, has a rich toolbox of rituals that honor the many transitions we undertake in our lives. However, the rabbis who codify many of these rituals had no conception of the life cycle moments of people outside of whose lives halakha, or Jewish law, tried to shape, particularly women. How do you find liberation in a tradition that didn't seek for you to be liberated? I will be speaking today about a particular ritual known as the mikveh and the ways in which it is being reimagined, reclaimed, and reinvented through feminist spirituality. So, this is it, a mikveh, not a jacuzzi. Kind of looks like it. So a mikveh means a collection or gathering, and here it is used for a gathering of water. And I'll get into this more later, but its traditional use is for women who are immersing after their menstrual cycle is completed. But it's also for people who are converting. People immerse there in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And just some information about it, it is supposed to be 90% natural water. So if you're ever on a mikveh roof, if you find yourself there, there will be a bunch of kind of big buckets that are gathering water. It's about 4 feet deep and mostly warm. And before you go in, you are supposed to separate any barriers between yourself and God or the water. So that means brushing your hair, combing it out, brushing your teeth, flossing, taking your nose ring out, all that stuff. Most people don't have nose rings who go in there, though. And you go into this kind of womb-like primordial space, and you dunk 3 times. I first encountered mikveh practice my first semester of my freshman year, and it made me furious. I was so mad at it, and I thought, how could my tradition produce something that is so sexist? And my professor, Catherine Kurz, said, great, I'm so glad it makes you mad. Now you have to go find out more about it. And obviously that worked, because here I am. So just some background. The first kind of idea of this came from the book of Leviticus, which is found in the Torah. And it was found in the section called the laws of purity. And there was the idea that you were either tumah, which is impure, or tahara, which is pure. This is all Hebrew. And there were tons of ways that you could become tumah, as listed up here. So there was this idea in ancient Israel that one moved in between these states of being pure and impure. And the reason why is because if you were in a state of tumah or impurity, you weren't allowed to approach the tabernacle because you would defile it. So you would wait the prescribed amount of time and then offer a sacrifice. But in 70 AD, the temple in Jerusalem, which was where these sacrifices were offered, was destroyed by the Romans, and most of the Jews were expelled. So in the diaspora, the rabbinic authorities created halakha, or Jewish law. And in the diaspora, the body really served as a central vehicle of holiness. So as such, the body was regulated: what you ate, what you drank, how you menstruated, how you gave birth. And so the question became, how do you remain holy in the diaspora? And while most of the laws of tumah didn't really matter anymore, nida remained, because if a woman had sex with her husband when she was tumah, he would become karet, or cut off from the community. So the question really was asked, how do you remain holy when you're not there? And this picture on the right is of a mikveh found on the top of Masada, and it's about 2,000 years old. So many people, not just me, were really angered by this tradition, and there was sort of a reclamation process that began with the second wave of feminism in the 1960s, as the first woman was ordained to the rabbinate. And so this is a quote that comes from a performance art piece called Mikveh Dreams from 1978. And it says, "Into a particular sacred symbol of the primal water womb, Mikveh, I enter regularly during my lifespan of natural fertility. Here I celebrate my own menses cycle, my personal holy body interface between the moon's tides and the earth's seasons." So as you'll see, people like Ukelis were really trying to reclaim this idea and feel this connection to some sort of divine feminine and to oneself. The first creative mikveh ritual we have was found in 1989 by a Reform rabbi named Sue Ann Wasserman, and this was called the mikveh ritual for Laura. And what happened was Laura had been raped and went to her friend and rabbi, Sue Ann Wasserman, and Sue Ann took her to the mikveh, even though it was very non-traditional. And this was a quote from the sort of reason why she took her. "When Laura was raped, I wanted to find a way to support her as her friend. As a rabbi, I needed to find a way for Judaism to respond to her. The mikveh seemed to be the most appropriate ritual for several reasons. It was predominantly our foremothers' ritual. It requires the whole body. Its waters flow in and out, representing continuity and process. Its waters symbolically flow from Eden, a place of wholeness. The natural waters remind us of the constant intermingling presence of the Creator in our own lives. Finally, water itself is cleansing, supportive, and life-sustaining." So, for the past 2 years, I've been a mikveh guide for a feminist community mikveh project called Immersively C. We're housed in an Orthodox mikveh, which is a whole presentation on itself, but we allow for people of all genders and sexualities and levels of observance to come and create a ritual and have a transformative Jewish experience. Immersively C was created by Rabbi Sarah Luria, who's a graduate of Hebrew Union College, and the goal of Immersively C is to create space for people to celebrate rituals of celebration and of loss. And one day I asked, why are we allowed to do this? Something about this doesn't seem like it was found in the Talmud, which is a book of rabbinic law. And I was told that these are unhalachic immersions. So basically, in the Talmud, there are a list of reasons why one has to go to the mikveh, but there's no list of reasons why you can't go. So it's a big loophole, which is awesome. And unhalachic here isn't meant to be derogatory, but what it actually is saying is that when halakha was created so long ago, that it didn't encompass everybody. And so now the project is to expand those borders. So during a mikveh guide training, Rabbi Sarah Luria asked, how can a community mikveh project change the world? So I found the answer. Some of the things that Immersively C is doing is first re-envisioning the role of the mikveh guide. The mikveh guide is seen as one of the scariest roles that you can possibly hold in Judaism. They're the person who sticks the needle through your earlobe to make sure that your piercing hole is clean. They're not the people that you want to be at a ritual, typically. But in this new paradigm of feminist leadership, the mikveh guide becomes somebody who's a ritual creator and a giver of pastoral care. And Immersively C actually just trained the first cohort of trans and gender nonconforming mikveh guides. Immersively C is also expanding the life cycle for opportunities to be transformed through using a traditional ritual object. There's also opportunities to collaborate across denominational boundaries. So I want to actually give you an example of something that happened just last week. A woman named Ariel Morkowitz reached out to me from the Agam Center, which is a group of Orthodox traditional women who are located in Washington, D.C. They seek to provide a space for women's spirituality and wellness that it expands upon the mikveh. Ariel was a mikveh guide at the synagogue where Rabbi Barry Frundle was, who was a rabbi who was charged with voyeurism at the mikveh in 2014. Women gathered to discuss all of the ways in which mikveh was painful, not just that experience, but all of them, having their bodies looked at and the body image and fertility issues that come up with it. Morkowitz says that even though they're an Orthodox organization, they want to partner with Immersively C because Morkowitz wants to be able to give a mikveh practice she believes in to her daughter. I want to share with you a story today of someone who I guided at the mikveh. It is a quiet evening on Manhattan's Upper West Side. I'm standing outside the West Side mikveh, situated around the corner from Fairway Market and the bustling traffic of Broadway. A sweet fragrance permeates the air outside the building, chlorine mixed with something sweet. Some say that the smell of the mikveh water is the closest one can get to the water of Eden. I'm a mikveh guide, a role traditionally understood to be held by an observant, married, or widowed heterosexual cisgender Jewish woman who acts as a witness to declare the immersion kosher. I am neither Orthodox nor married. I am a 22-year-old college senior with pink hair and leopard print shoes, the daughter of a Reformed Jewish mother and a Roman Catholic father who was bat mitzvahed and baptized. It is a chilly evening, and when my immersee Yael arrives, she is wrapped up to her nose in a colorful scarf, which she removes as we enter the building together, revealing tendrils of purple hair. Together, we disappear down the stairs to the changing rooms in the mikveh pool. It's our space now. Yael and I sit together on a bench outside of the mikveh prep room. I turn towards her and I ask, "What is on your heart and mind?" She takes a deep breath, pulling a case onto her lap that I soon will learn is a ukulele. I'm finally doing it. I'm moving out of the country, she tells me, and there is both anxiety and fear in her voice. I don't know why I chose to come here, to the mikveh. I'm Israeli. The only women who go to the mikveh in Israel are ultra-religious women. I just love water. She reveals that while she has a limited understanding of mikveh, she knows that there is something inherently related to sexuality in the practice. She recalls several past partners who have left her feeling vulnerable and hurt, and she declares that this ritual will also be about self-healing, a radical departure from the traditional use of mikveh immersion as a halakhically sanctioned way of making a woman ready to have sex with her husband. It is clear that while unique in her own way, Yael's reason for coming to the mikveh is similar to other immersions I facilitated, the desire to feel vulnerable in a contained space. Before Yael disappears into the changing room, I point out that while the West Side mikveh has their own traditional checklist of preparations noted on a laminated sheet next to the sink, Immersively C encourages our immersees to remove the barriers between themselves and God or the water in a way that feels comfortable for them. When Yael reappears, her hair is wet and dripping fat purple drops that stain the robe. I recall that during my own immersion, the waters of the mikveh turned neon pink. "Is everything okay?" I ask, suddenly realizing that Yael's making no move to follow me into the mikveh. I notice that she is still carrying the ukulele case. "Yes," she says, I know it's not Orthodox, but I wanted to play a song and sing it with you before I go in. Is that okay?" I don't ask why this song or why this is important to her. That is not my job. It is my job to be the container, to empty myself of my own preconceived notions in order to be the non-judgmental facilitator of this ritual. When we enter the mikveh room, Yael and I sit down on the shimmering tile floor. She hands me the lyrics to a song by Rabbi Regina Spektor. It started out as a feeling, which then grew into a hope, which then turned into a quiet thought, which then turned into a quiet word. And then that word grew louder and louder till it was a battle cry. Tears are in Yael's eyes when we finish singing. We rise and she hands me the ukulele. I set it down safely. She has asked me, as her guide, to watch, to make sure that her entire body is submerged in the water. Yael begins her descent in, pausing on each step to reflect or pray or just to have a quiet moment. Rather than pronouncing kosher, which is said by the mikveh lady for halachic immersions, Yael has asked for something else. When her immersion concludes, I say shalem, whole. In 2006, the Conservative Rabbinical Assembly retranslated Tumah and Tahara, previously meaning impure and pure, to be ready and not ready, hearkening back to the temple. You were either ready to make a sacrifice or not ready. I believe that Immerse NYC is doing this in practice, through calling the Jewish community to accountability as to who they view as the abject, showing the feminist importance of modeling power and permeability, and creating a mikveh ritual and a Jewish practice that could truly contain all bodies. Thank you. If anybody has one.
Has anything? Gotta be snappy though, because we have 5 minutes.
Would you accept a non-gender conforming biological male family here into
Yes, so unfortunately, all of Judaism was built on a gender binary, but we are rapidly trying to fix that. And what's interesting about Immerse NYC is the building we're housed in very much still adheres to that. But what Immerse NYC is doing is training people of all gender identities to be mikveh guides, and we're sneakily trying to find ways to have that happen. And you can use bodies of water. So an ocean, there are stories of women in Sweden who would hack through ice to immerse in water. It's pretty hardcore. And cool.
Is there a list that you can find for your presentation with a list of non-binary, like throughout all those countries? Because that's kind of fascinating to me. A huge list you had, like where everybody goes to find more research. Send them your PowerPoint.
I think the PowerPoints will be available online, but if you
I hope they're made available online. I believe there's also a PBS kind of like map of non-binary gender. The language they use is like a little problematic. They're still kind of stuck in the biological sex dimorphism, but I hope it's made available. That was a list I worked hard to compile, and I find it so exciting to see it across the world and know that there's so many more that aren't even listed there.
We probably have time for one more if anybody has one. None of us have a timepiece, so we don't actually.
What about your process of working together?
Yeah, it was it was really beautiful, actually, and happened very, very naturally. I think the second we got into a room together, we realized that we shared so much in terms of worldview and just sort of what we wanted to get across in our presentations. And I knew Emily a bit before, but I had never met Hannah, and we've quickly become good friends. And I think that's because through this project, we found these through lines that connected our work so sort of naturally and easily, and it was really beautiful. There was never a moment of contention or I don't know if you guys want to say anything more than that, but
There was when you had pink hair at the beginning of the semester. We were a little worried, but now we're okay.
Yeah. It's her trademark. So sorry. But yeah, it's actually been a really beautiful, fulfilling experience for me, at least. And I was terrified at the beginning because I've never spoken in front of a group of people, and presenting work generally is scary, but having supportive, lovely people around you and, you know, sort of that spirit of kindness has been very, very helpful in making this whole thing happen. I think I should probably get out of here.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.